documentation, and I guess the major thing here is hopefully you can get some understanding of OpenAPI documentation, what it is, a kind of overview of what it looks like and how it's created, and how it's useful. And then towards the end, we're going to integrate that content into Hugo website, just to try and close the loop. Now, I chose Hugo because I work for Papercut, and Papercut's main website is on Hugo. So that was kind of my strategic decision to go with Hugo. The integration between Hugo and API is not as simple as I'd hoped, so I'm still on a journey. And what I'm saying is that as I'm still going through that journey, Hugo may not be the best choice for you. But the principles and ideas that I present are applicable across any static site generator and integration with OpenAPI. It all kind of vaguely works the same way. And you're going to see some of these things. Now, last month, I sort of presented a workflow where a documentarian was able to create and edit content on the local workstation and use a local installation of Hugo to kind of review that and do that. And then when they were happy, they could push their changes into a cloud service. We're using GitLab here, but it could be anything, via the version control tool, and a cloud-based Hugo instance was spun up, which would build the static web content, which was then provided to the cloud service, to a web server. It's just a bunch of flat files, remember, provided to the web service, and then the consumer of the documentation can just use a standard web browser to look at the content. And the benefit of using this approach is it's simple to use once you get it all set up. It's automatic, so just by pushing changes from your workstation into the cloud service, then content is automatically deployed. And it's fast, and in this case of GitLab, you don't incur any dollar charges, so that's quite cool. And these are the steps that we went through: installing Hugo, creating a basic project, installing a theme. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Configuring the project, we won't have to go back to that, we've already done it. And then we're going to be creating new content this time, build on top of existing content, and be looking at previewing the results. So basically a subset of what we've already done. And then this is how we got stuff into the cloud. So these were the slides that you saw last month, if you were here. So hopefully those of you here kind of remember all that, and I'll try and not assume too much knowledge going forward, because I'm guessing there's quite a few people who weren't here last month. But I'm going to focus for now on OpenAPI documentation. So let's talk a bit about APIs, what API documentation needs to contain. I'm not going to focus on the mechanics, and that's kind of the major portion of this talk, or the sort of most important part of this talk is what OpenAPI specifications look like and what you can do with them, and how you create them and edit them. And then the last bit will be just adding that into a Hugo website, which will probably take the longest because that's actually a practical demonstration. So let's review what an API is. So an API is a contract between two different pieces of software to exchange messages and perform, to have the server perform work on behalf of the client. So there's always this concept of a client, which is making requests to something called a server, the server performing some action perhaps, and then returning information back. The information could be as simple as a status code, or it might be as complex as data, a multi-join table from a database, which you don't see, you just get a bunch of data back. Now, the API is not actually any software to do that. It's the actual documentation that outlines what requests a client can make and what responses the server gets back. And these pieces of software can exist anywhere. So for instance, on your watch, if you have an electronic watch like this, there will be different bits of software talking to sensors, and the method that the software applications on your watch use to talk to sensors will be an API. And that's not a network API, that's probably some sort of binary API or something similar to technology. But often when people talk about APIs now, they are specifically referring to network APIs, and that's API calls that occur across the network. So for instance, if I've got my smartphone and I've got my watch, they talk to each other across the network using network APIs and there's various different types of network APIs. We'll be talking about RESTful ones. I'll talk a bit more about REST in a minute. But again, when it comes to the fact, it's a contract. It's not a piece of working software. And it's a document that says, this is what you can send me and this is what I will respond with. Does that hopefully all make sense to people? Now, when you write API documentation, unfortunately, often you will see a reference document that says, here are all the calls you can make, here are all the responses you get, and that's it. And that's not enough. You need to approach API documentation in a similar way to the way you approach normal product documentation. So, think about your audience. What do they need to achieve? What the information is they need. You need to sort of consider things like the data model. So, you need to teach them the concepts around your API. You need to give them guidance around specific topics and activities they need to perform. They obviously do need the reference, and the reference is what we're going to focus on today. But they need troubleshooting guides, they need example code. So an API specification is not adequate documentation for your API. You need to do all the other stuff around it, and stuff that hopefully you're already familiar with. There are some differences that you need to be aware of. For instance, so my favorite sort of expression is that if you're documenting a product like an accounting package, then that's designed to work a certain way, it's designed to perform a certain set of tasks. You can clearly articulate the user's journey through what they're trying to do and provide them with guidance along the way. But an API is like a Lego set. All you're giving you're giving people blocks of plastic, and the bits of plastic fit together in certain ways, or the bits of software fit together in certain ways. But once you adhere to those very simple ground rules, you can build whatever you want. Okay. And you have no, as a documentarian and a software developer, you have no kind of say over how those things will fit into other systems. So you really got to think. You really got to have a much more open-ended documentation in terms of presenting people with options and possibilities, saying these are the sorts of things you could do with it, but making your documentation such that it doesn't lock. You're not only describing certain aspects that you understand, or certain use cases that you understand, and not giving them enough information to develop their own solutions based on their own unique needs. And that's kind of, I guess, the most important mindset change you got to make, is going from I'm documenting a doll's house to I'm documenting a Lego set. So yeah, adaptable knowledge content. So going back to my earlier point, your API documentation, a reference is not good enough. You need the normal concept, tasks, troubleshooting type sections that you're used to seeing, and that is where the work occurs. That's a significant amount of documentation effort in APIs. Okay, but you still need, and you also need security information. But incidentally, that's worth making a special point of. Security, API security is an important topic. Many APIs are publicly available. So, for instance, the Australian government provides lots of data through APIs. Google obviously provides services through APIs. GitLab, all of these public, hundreds of thousands of public APIs out there, and they are subject to abuse. So security and documenting the security requirements of your APIs is pretty critical. I mentioned that we were talking about specification of RESTful API. So RESTful API, now strictly speaking, there are some authors who say, well, what I'm about to show you in OpenAPI-based specifications are not truly RESTful for various technical reasons, but it's near enough. So when you hear somebody talk about a RESTful API, they're basically talking about what I'm showing you, perhaps with some, if it's truly RESTful, there's some nuances on top, but this kind of works for that still. But the point is that in an API, in a REST type API, you have some client code which initiates a conversation with an API server, which is this cloud thing in the middle here. And the cloud, the REST API server is responding with payloads of data and statuses. And the specification is a specification that outlines what information the client can send and what responses it can set back. So that's all it's covering. It's just covering these requests and responses that are occurring over the network between the client and the API server. Okay. And the reason for this model is that you can accomplish a lot with it. And RESTful APIs are ubiquitous, I think is a correct word. Now, there are other API technologies. So, for instance, a legacy API technology is XML RPC, which we still use at Papercut. However, technology like OpenAPI Spec is not suitable for documenting these other types of technologies. Okay, there are exceptions. There's a technology from Google called Google Remote Procedure Call, which can be documented with some modifications by OpenAPI Spec. But generally, OpenAPI Spec is limited to RESTful APIs. And in fact, look at the documentation, this is for RESTful APIs. So be aware of what technology platform you're using before you jump in. So this is the important slide. This tells you 30,000-foot view, exactly what's in an API specification. So, conceptually, it's pretty simple. It tells you what are the actual connection points I can make on the API server to connect for access resources. What verbs can I use? So the resource, example of resources or endpoint might be user. I can access things about users. I might be able to get a user, so I might be able to get information about a user, and that's a verb. But I might not be able to use delete, for instance. I might not be able to delete users. So it specifies the verbs I could use. I might have to supply information about the endpoint. So I might say which user I want to talk to about, or want to talk about. And so that's a parameter that I supply from the client to the server to say this is the user of interest. And then when the server responds to me with information, it will return a payload, and all that's documented in the specification as well. Each response from the server will have a status code. So like the most famous one is 200, which means everything's good. We are the ones like in the 400 series, means there's been an error. And you'll see some examples of this in a minute. We can also document security information, and we can actually add in other bits of information which are quite useful. So there's sort of free text in inverted commas to add descriptions and example responses and this type of thing. We can add in metadata about the specification, where it comes from, details about the server, if it's a well-known server that we want to make accessible on the internet. And you can document this stuff in either JSON or YAML. We're going to be using YAML today because it's a bit less verbose. And that link in there, I'm publishing, these slides are published. That specification is kind of the best introduction I've seen to OpenAPI on it. It's actually from the OpenAPI website. There are three things you can essentially do with OpenAPI specs. So you can generate documentation, which is what we're doing today. You can also, you can actually verify a specification to make sure it's technically correct, which is quite useful. And once you've got a valid specification, you can generate some code, which is probably not of interest here, but remember I said that an API specific, or an API is actually a contract, but along with that contract, you can supply helper software to enable third-party developers to get started more quickly, because you're abstracting away some of the details in these software development kits. And you can generate the software development kits with various tools from the specification. Okay, let's look at an example. Before I jump into that, any questions? It's all making sense, I hope. I can't see the chat, so if anybody can make one of the chat and let me know if there's any questions, that'd be great.
There's no questions at this time.
Okay, cool. So the first thing you'll see in an OpenAPI specification, I'll say this one is YAML. The content in a JSON format spec is identical. It just obviously got more curly braces and stuff like that. But this is YAML. Is what I'm calling the preamble or the front matter. So there are various different versions of the specification that support different features. 3. I can't remember if 3.2 is out, but the most up-to-date version is 3.1. This is 3.0. There's an information block that's mandatory. The specification version is mandatory. The info block is mandatory. Description fields and summary fields are free format, and so on. The servers, I was hoping to demonstrate that today, but you can actually set up demonstration servers, and people can hit these environments from within the documentation to actually test them, get some understanding. That's quite useful. And again, description free format. So this is kind of the bare minimum you'd see at the front. You can get more, you would see more information and more fields. And the thing that the specification defines is what these things on the left mean and what you can put on the right. So, you know, OpenAPI is a YAML entity. All YAML entities are followed by a colon, and then it tells you what you can put on the right as the value for this entity. And then that data can be read by various tools, including some we're going to look at today, and it can generate code, or it can generate HTML for us. And we're going to see it generate HTML. So that's kind of the preamble bit. You'll see that at the beginning of every specification. The next thing you'll see is this thing called paths. And under this is kind of the biggest bit of any specification. It specifies, remember I talked about endpoints, so it specifies the actual things that you can talk to. So there's on this particular server, there's an endpoint called /people, which is part of the URL. And then it tells you what verbs that this endpoint will support. So for instance, we've got a user management thing here. So you can say /people, and you can give it the verb get. And that's all handled by your software libraries. You just tell it what you want to do. You want to do a get, and you want to do it on this URL /people, and it will get a list of all the details of all the users in the database. Okay, and you might have some parameters, and you'll have some responses. And we'll go into more details in a minute. But this is everything you'll see around for each endpoint is the actual endpoint itself and the verbs it supports, the parameters that using that verb may or may not need, and the responses that you may or may not get back when you make that call. Now, let's see an example of some parameters. So I remember I said parameters in here. I'm going to expand that out a bit. So here we've got a URL for people, and it's get, but you can pass a parameter with a specific ID in it, and it's the name of the person. It's actually their ID, not their name, but it's a query parameter. So what we would do is that with this information, we are documenting an API call that looks a bit like that. So it's the /people, then it's the query, which starts with a query sign, and then the name of the field, which is ID. Name which is ID there. The fact it's a query field, so it appears here, doesn't appear elsewhere, and it's a type integer, and it's got a minimum and maximum value. So actually documenting a reasonable amount about the specifics of how to call this. Yeah. Let's look at a path parameter, which is slightly different. So here if you look down the bottom here, we've got people /123. So that's a path. If we look down here, it's people query ID equals 123. So those are two ways you can pass parameters. This one's a path ID, but again, the concepts are the same. It's still got a name, which is referenced between here and here. It is still required. It has the same type. Now, you wouldn't do both. You would, for this type of thing, you'd normally have a query, but some people prefer path parameters, and it depends on the design of your API server, how it's going to look. But the point is, there's two different ways of specifying parameters. Once you've documented a call, you then have to document the responses. So this is the responses you can get back here. When an API server returns content or returns from an API call that you've made to it, it will provide initially an HTTP status code. And these status codes are public, they're documented, they're standard. Just do a Google search for HTTP statuses and you'll get a list of probably several hundred that there are. But given that you got a 200 back, it then tells you what's the content of the response. In this particular case, this API call returns a JSON object, and it's actually an array because it's a list of users. So we got an array of them. And each array entry has an identity, a first name, a last name, an employee type in this case, and it has a reference to a sub-component. So this is a concept called address, which is defined elsewhere. And we provide an example of what you can get back. And we'll see these examples being used later on. So what can you do with this type of content? Well, you use a generator to generate some web content. So you take your JSON specification or your YAML specification, and you run it through one of these tools, and it will spew out valid web content. And that'll be fairly complex stuff. It'll be some HTML, some JavaScript, some CSS, and yeah, we'll have a look at that in a minute. These are the three well-known ones. But I'm not going to use that because I've had a few problems with this. These are not simple things to use. So I actually used Rapidoc, which has given me the best results so far. It's not perfect again, but it's I think it's got the possibility for a simpler implementation, which is what I'm about at the moment. I'm trying to bootstrap our documentation, so I'm all about rapid delivery. I will go back and revisit this and spend some time and maybe get help from the web team to customize this, and maybe look at using one of these other tools. Okay, let's do a demo.
Sorry,
so I'm going to pick up from where.
Do you want to take questions at the end, or are you happy for answering questions?
This is a good point for questions right now.
Okay, so we've got a question. Does the summary field in that OpenAPI spec support multiple paragraphs or blocks or links?
The description certainly does. You can use common markdown.
Okay.
I should have an example. I can't remember. I think the summary probably does as well, but I can't remember. Any other questions?
No, that's all for now. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm actually going to pick up where we left off. So let's just recap where we were last month. So we've got a Hugo website, and I'm going to just display it on my local machine. So it's generated 9 pages, and if I jump over to here, there is our page. There's also not page, website. Website consists of a top-level page with this nice logo on it. And it's also got 2 subsections: getting started and creating content. And that's it. It's pretty simple. There's actually just 3 markdown files. And you remember that we've got this really nice sort of theming thing, and you can choose whatever theme you want. And this one supports coloring. I'm going to set it to automatic for the time being. And that's it. Nice and simple. That's where we were. And in order to do that, let's just close this down. We had this content. So we had some things we didn't need to care about, but we did have this content directory, and in this content directory reflects what I've just shown you, which is a top-level index file, which because we're writing in Markdown, so they're the MDs, and they'll get translated for us into HTML files. And we put this magic underscore in front of the top-level page. Where to say this is the entry point for this section, and we just got 2 sections in there. We've got the index file, yeah. And the rest we don't need to care about. But we did install a theme, if you remember, but we don't need to talk about that anymore. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add new content, and the content I'm going to add is this YAML file, and I'll create a new section called API reference. I'm going to put that YAML file in it, and let's have a look. And if I've done this right, there's my YAML file. So this is just the stuff I show you in the slides in the code editor. So we've got the preamble. There's a description that goes over more than 1 line. You just use this horizontal bar, and then you just do text. There's a summary there. I don't know if that would work. We can play with this just to answer that question. I like answering questions. On the edge, I'll break my own demo. Anyway, But again, exactly the same concept as I showed you in the slides. So here we've got a people URL, we've got a get verb, we've got no parameters because it just gets a list of all the users. It returns an array, right? What's more interesting is it's a 204 response here, which is no users found. So that's an error, and there's no payload for this. It's just you got a 204. There's nothing to show you. And there's a default for everything else, which is an unexpected error, no payload. So you might get 402, 403, all sorts of things you might get back, but we're just saying that's an unexpected error. We've got a post where we add a new, so this is where you add a new person. And here, we actually have to send some information to the API service and a request body. So it's the information that's going from the client to the server. And again, it's just an application. It's a JSON payload in this particular case. And it's a first name, last name, a type, and an address. And these addresses, they all look the same, so they're defined elsewhere. 201, new record created successfully, and we're returning the new user ID. Okay, and that is an example of where this is not truly RESTful, because you shouldn't return raw data like that. But it's a very common model to see that thing. You should really return a URI or a URL, which corresponds to this, if it was truly RESTful. But I think that's a. I can see why they're saying that. But it's being a bit picky. I still consider this to be a RESTful API to all intents and purposes. 409, right? Okay. Here's an example of a path parameter. So again, I'm just repeating what I've said in the slide, so I'm going to speed up a bit. The responses you get back, an example of the responses. So this actually will display an example to the developer when they look at the documentation with real content or pseudo-real content. So it helps give them a bit more context rather than just describing it as a structure with 2 integers and 3 strings. You can actually say, well, it looks like this. We got the delete. And then down here, so you notice here that, for instance, I'm saying, well, this is an address. And then you say, well, the address is actually a reference to another thing called an address. And then down here, I actually define address as its own object with its own data structure. So this is how you can reuse content across the specification and not repeat yourself. Yeah. So that's kind of all the way through the YAML specification. Now, I'm going to take I've taken the most simple approach I can to do this, to make this demo manageable and to present as huge concept as possible. In order to make RapidDoc work, then then all we do is copy an index.html file from the internet. So I'm just looking at these, just following these instructions here. And it just says, well, take this content, copy it onto your website, reference the correct JSON or Swagger file or YAML file, and it is all good to go. And that is the truth. So I've just created this file, and because it's Hugo, I called it _index.html. And so just plain it because it's a magic thing at the top level of its section. I've added the additional front matter I need for Hugo. This is Hugo specific stuff, which we went through last month. And what I've said is reference the Open API specification YAML file that's already loaded into the system. And then I've added some extra parameters just for aesthetics reasons, but you should experiment with this if you use this tool. So now, if you look at the content thing, I've actually added this new section called API reference. It's got this underscore index.html file. It's actually got the YAML content as well. So let's test it. So it's now generated 11 pages, not 9. So it's generated a couple of extra pages. And if I go into here and hit refresh, we've got an API reference section now that's appeared as a new section. And if I click on that, I've kept the theme, but now I've got all of this YAML beautifully rendered as a nice HTML page. And it gives me information. It's rendering the documentation in a way that I can understand. And if I hit the example button, which is a bad example, that's another bad example. There we are. So I'm actually providing a real life example of what it would look like. And so this is an array of, users. Each user consists of an ID and this, that, and the other. And so on. And if I had it set up properly, you could actually try it out. So if I hit try, it would be trying to hit the API server on localhost, because that's the way I documented it. But it's not running, so there's nothing to see. That'd be pretty simple. So you can actually provide third-party developers an interactive playground just by writing specification files. So they can try out the API and see some of the things they can get back from it. That's really quite valuable. Otherwise, they've got to use something like Postman or write some code. And I've got the theme at the top here, so I can jump back up to the root of there. The only other thing that might be worth mentioning is that this is API as appearing at the bottom of the list because I did the correct front matter and said this is a lower priority item in the or a lower priority section. So it didn't follow alphabetical things. That's the weight parameter in Hugo. That's a Hugo feature. So there's probably another chance to ask us any questions.
Yeah, there's a question about, do you manually create this spec, the YAML spec, the OpenAPI spec manually, or is it there's some sort of a system that generates this for you?
You could do either. Currently, we are doing it manually.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're using the specification to generate code for us, including server-side code. There are tools which I have not used, and I don't know how good they are, that allow you to generate specs from servers. You implement the server and then it generates some of all the specification for you. I think if you're starting greenfield, then you would manually create a specification file, because that's your single source of truth, and then everything flows from that. But if you've got an existing server code that you want to document, then do experiment with generators and see what you get. Your mileage may vary.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the other questions, based on the tools you've mentioned, Redocly, OpenAPI, Swagger, Rapidoc, have you been able to integrate data style topics, so tasks, concepts, reference?
No. So the way I do it is that I treat all the data stuff would appear here, and the API reference just contains reference information.
Yeah.
Now, many people, and I don't necessarily agree with this, try and do everything from this document, and so they will just extend these descriptions with more content, with all this sort of descriptive concept content. I don't think that's the right approach. I think that's confusing. You want to lead people, you want to give people a journey from kind of the beginning of your documentation through. So here I'll be adding, and this also is trying to do a selling job of your content, of your API, because you want people to use your API. This is their introduction to your API. They need to understand, why am I here? What can I do? How hard is it going to be? And just jumping people straight into this reference document and trying to document everything in here is, in my opinion, quite confusing and hard to follow. Now, having said that, I have seen and experienced people they go to this website, and the only thing they look for is a reference. They just jump straight into here and they just start reading this. So it's up to you. So I've answered the question. I'm not sure. I think there's no inherent support in here for what we would call proper product documentation. So I think that's probably the way to put it. So no, but people do try and put everything into here, and I think that's a mistake myself. Okay, I'm hoping if I've done a proper job, we can now push it to the internet. So I upgraded the Hugo theme. So I just want to go back now and start reiterating something that I talked about before. So we were using the Hugo theme called version 11 last time. people probably don't know that much detail, but trust me. But since then, there's been a nice new feature which kind of makes it easier to display this stuff in a wider format. So I've actually upgraded this to 13.4, and that's just good documentation practice when you deploy, or software development practice generally, is always when you're deploying public stuff, make sure that you fully understand what versions of everything of your dependencies you're deploying. Everything else is identical. Okay. Now it's possible that if you use a more complicated OpenSpec deploy or OpenSpec set of tools, then you'd have to put extra steps in here to do additional generation or make further modifications. But I've deliberately chose Rapidoc, which is very simple. So I've got away with not having to make any changes here. So now I'm going to add in my files. So I've actually added these two this OpenAPI YAML file and this index.html file. And what you didn't see was I've also committed in that that change to the theme version, just so that it gets upgraded. And now I should be able to push to the main website, which I don't have open, didn't plan that. Hopefully my deployment. I haven't tested this because okay, it didn't take. I've made a mess of it because I didn't consider that my changes were in detached mode. Okay. If I was doing this properly, instead of part two disjoint demonstrations separated by a month, those changes would have pushed, and I would be seeing on the website exactly what you can see here. But because I've detached one from the other for demonstration purposes, and now it's not working, which is a bit of a shame. Which is trying to take these wind out myself, but that is how it works, and that would work if I had not done it that way. But I could probably. Right, that's it. Well, people ask me more questions. I will try and fix this up so it does work, but carry on.
Okay, thanks, Alec. There's a question about, does it provide an option to automatically copy a value from a first API response to the request of the next API in a sequential workflow? So for example, in the first API, I'm fetching a list of users, and in the next, I want to retrieve details of a specific user. So will this tool, I'm assuming it's Rapidoc that this person's asking about, allow me to configure a way to copy first value of the response to the request of the next API? I hope I've got that correct. Rohit, if you need to sort of expand more on this, feel free to unmute and ask that question directly.
No, that's absolutely correct the way you asked it.
Okay, so this in a document. Are you talking about when you're hitting the try this button? Or are you talking, because this is a documentation tool, so you're presenting each API call as a distinct standalone thing, whereas you seem to want to sort of have some sort of workflow engine. Am I misunderstanding the question?
So say, for example, there is a sequential workflow, like I want to edit a detail of a specific user. Okay, so the first call I'll make is retrieve details of all the users if I don't have the ID. Then in the next call, I'll fetch the ID, I'll fetch the details of a specific user. And in the third call, I'll go and update the data of that user.
Yeah.
So in this case, say for example, on my documentation portal with Try It Now option, I want to show this functionality so that consumer can understand it in a better way.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah. So if
So
I want to
I
show
think
this sequential workflow, will I be able to do that?
So that's a really interesting question. And I think what you've hit upon the fact, well, upon the things you've hit upon there is that thing I was brushing over, which is that these REST-like APIs are not truly RESTful. So it's not returning a URI. When you create a user, it doesn't return a URI, so you can then make a call on that resource, for instance. It's returning IDs, and so you actually have to embed the logic of how to manage that stuff in your code. So I think the answer to your question is no, but that's a limitation of the way that people do these REST-like APIs. I don't think the tool generators are built, or documentation generators are built in a way to present. I've never seen that sort of feature in any of these tools. That doesn't mean to say it doesn't exist, but I've never seen it discussed. I don't think it's what they're designed for. They're designed for generating just sort of these standalone blocks of, this is an API call to do this is an API call to do that, and you have to connect the dots. And the way that I do that is I actually ship working examples. So I give a presentation, was it, I can't remember if it was Open Doc Sydney, right, Doc Sydney or not, no, it's somewhere else, about API documentation. And one of the things I emphasize is providing developers with complete working examples that show the whole life cycle of a solution, from setting the thing up, doing a security, making an API call, doing something useful with it, recovering from problems with non-trivial use cases. So that's how I do that with sample code. And when I say sample, I mean a complete working app. I probably talked a lot there. I'm not sure that have I moved you forward.
Okay, there's another question here about regarding the specification files generated from the services directly. Does that mean that the summary, the groupings, and the description of each endpoint is documented somewhere in the services code, or do these system generators populate an existing API spec? No.
So again, never use them, so I'm not sure specifics, but some tools do have the ability to read embedded comments. So a lot of systems like Go and Java have tools to you format your functions. You put a comment block around near your function definition. You specify the parameters and using a specific layout of comments, and then that can be parsed. And if the comments have been correctly done in the source code, which is unusual in my experience, then that can be parsed out and added to the specification. But you're going to have to experiment, because it's going to completely depend on how the code's been written and how diligent developers were at adding these magic comments, and whether the tools that you have will support it.
Yes, just want to add on to that. I've worked on for API documentation, and in which case the API documentation was generated from Java source code. So I had to go in and actually write things in that Java source code so that the correct documentation is generated. So it very much works like you say.
Yeah. Just as a trivial thing, I've just fixed the GitLab stuff, so that's now being published on GitLab. I had to merge my detached changes into the main branch and then just push it, and it worked pretty easily. And the proof is that, just so I'm not lying, there's the job that just ran whilst I was talking to you. So that's actually the deployment on GitLab pages. So anyway, trivial, but it does work. To go back to Gurus.
Yeah, Alec, would I be able to ask a quick question, please?
Sure.
Hi, just wondering, I totally get that developers often don't actually document things well, and that an API is a great place for them to get some of their own understanding in order. I'm just trying to figure out how to best motivate the developers where I work to actually create an API for their own benefit rather. Obviously, there's the outward benefits to people using our product, but what would be the internal benefits for them to really motivate them to get their documentation up to scratch?
I find a big stick works quite well. To be serious, so they can verify this. So if you're starting from, if it's a new project, you can have a different discussion. If it's a new project, well, guys, write your OpenAPI specs, and you don't have to write any documentation at all. It's done for you, and your design is verified before you write code, and you can share the documentation with wider audience before the code even works.
Yeah, we currently have a wiki that that has some reference code in it, which is really not good enough. And so they were initially thinking, oh, we could have something nice and interactive. So my idea was that, the API obviously makes sense to have that interaction for people to be able to test things out, which they can't do on our wiki. But getting them motivated to actually create that is the problem. So it exists already.
So if they write the OpenAPI specification, they can have that because, and this is the thing I didn't get working today, but if they go into the API reference and I've got this API server allegedly running on localhost 8000, and there's a try button. So if they write this YAML or whatever it is correctly, then they can publish this on the internal website, and there's a try button, and they can, they can document the security. People can try it out. So it means people will ask them fewer questions.
That's a good point.
Now we're talking about an existing project, and then we're going to, why would I retrofit this stuff onto an existing project? And that's a harder discussion, to be honest. But the thing is, if you do this and you publish this beautiful interactive stuff, you will get fewer questions, and it will increase your professional projects. It will increase your professional standing, understanding of your project, that you produce easy to understand code that produces an interactive playground in which people can try things out. And also the other thing is that if you give your consumers this YAML document, they can generate their own client libraries, or you can generate it for them in an automatic fashion. So every time you update the YAML document with a new feature, like a new parameter or something like that, you push a button and it'll generate client code, which makes the consumers' lives easier.
That is absolutely awesome. That, I think, is our selling point.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Credibility, that was what I was looking for. It increases their professional credibility and the credibility of their project. I was quite interested in what Gaurav was saying about stuff, having to add in extra stuff to the documentation. So that is quite right. I'm prepared to show you some stuff that I've been working on. It's not public yet. It will be at some point in the future. But if we got time, I'll spend 5 minutes going through this.
If it's not,
so this is.
Sorry, if it's not public yet, do you want me to stop recording, or are you happy to keep this going? I can.
Well, I'll keep it going. It's going to be published hopefully in a few weeks, so it's not a big drama if it leaks out. So this is basically the thing I'm developing that led me to do these talks. But in here, I'm going to follow the same model. And if you go to the content page, there is API security. If you go to the content model, there is the same thing as I had before, which is an API reference. This is using read doc for historical reasons. But if you go in here, so currently, I initially wrote this file. But now what's happening is, as we're adding new features to it, the developers are adding stuff to this file, and then I'm tweaking it and fixing it up and kind of making, if I need to modify the English, I do. But so we're working on this together. It's a together thing. But once that, I'm still working on all the front page stuff. So all the wordy stuff And again, I'm following exactly the same structure you've already seen. So this is not a revelation. So again, I've got the API reference here, and the majority of this content is now done by the developers. Pretty slow. Why is it so slow? But I still am responsible for the final output of this, and I still help maintain it. But the developers do this because it's part of their, so the overall design of the API is done, but the developers then generate this content and it helps them understand what they're doing. And they can generate, so some of these data structures are a bit more complex. So here's a slightly more complex data structure. And so they have questions about this. There's stuff, they look at the design documents, it doesn't answer all the questions, but by documenting this, they have to ask those questions and understand them. So it's a topic that comes up on an almost daily basis whilst this is on development. And then they also use this to generate this Go server code. And they're not actually generating the functional code, they're generating the Go data structures that are needed to support this API. So it's saving them some work, but they know that if I agree to this and the tech lead who's doing the design agrees to this, it's probably all right. So it saves them that sort of back and forth and trying things out, and they implement stuff and it doesn't work because there was some underlying assumption. So it removes a lot of the assumptions. So the message I was trying to get to is predominantly now the developers maintain all this content, and I maintain all the other stuff. So I write all the content which is around use cases. Why do you want to do here? What's the API security? Here's some terms and conditions. I'm responsible for all the rest, which is actually stuff that takes a long time to write. Does that kind of square with your experience, Gaurav?
Yeah, but like ideally, I would like to have that. Like in the ideal scenario, one would create the specification first and then write the code based on that specification. But in my case, the code is already there, which generates the spec file. So I've been there. Yeah,
I've been there. I ended up publishing raw Java doc, or not raw Java doc. I ended up generating Java doc output, and it could be pretty painful. It doesn't display well on the web. There's no easy tools to display on the web page. There's a whole list of problems why it's painful. The benefit with this is that initially I got handed a couple of these API calls already done, so it was easy to document. Then responsibility and myself moved over to a new project, and they're young and enthusiastic, and they had to do a mock. They've got to implement the rest of the APIs, which is significant. So they started from an OpenAPI spec. Yeah, so I'm lucky.
Yeah, that's great.
Ah,
that's on my lap. That does not look comfortable.
I think you're talking to a pet rather than us, Lana. Any other questions? I've gone over time, sorry.
No, that's all right. Thanks for this, Alex. It's been really good. I use OpenAPI specs at the moment for my Redocly docs, and yeah, it's pretty much the same. Like we can embed some of these API references into our reference docs generated out of that, but also developer portal. So yeah, really good. Thank you for your presentation.
My very great pleasure.
Thank you. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, Alex.
Joining in, and I will post a link to the video and also links from Alex's presentations from both the talks, and hopefully you'll see some more information on some next events coming up soon. So thank you everyone, and have a good day.